I'm a big fan of Disney. Every December I like to go back and play some of the classic Disney games, the good ones, and the not so good ones. And now that I'm doing top 10s, I figure why not count down some of the classic Disney games. So for this week's list, I figured let's go back to the 8-bit era and look at the absolute worst Disney-related games. These are games on the systems like the Game Gear, Game Boy, Master System, and the NES. So without further ado, here are the top 10 worst 8-bit Disney games. Kicking off this list is The Jungle Book, in particular, the NES version. While I do have some fond memories with the SNES and Genesis versions of the game, the NES version was really just kind of ugly. It came out very late in the NES lifecycle and didn't do anything to show off what the NES was capable of doing. The 8-bit renditions of some of the Jungle Book music wasn't too bad, but the overall slippery controls and just lackluster platforming just made Jungle Book really not that fun of an experience, and why it ends up making this list. Some may argue that these shouldn't even be on the list because they're edutainment titles, but I feel like Mickey's Adventure in Numberland and Mickey's Safari in Letterland really don't even do a good job as far as the edutainment value. I feel like a good edutainment game has enough fun gameplay to not only be an enjoyable experience to play, but also is able to teach you whatever it is they're trying to teach. And I feel like the slow, overall kind of just bland platforming that is in both of these titles really wouldn't engage kids of any age, and definitely wouldn't teach them anything. When Disney is brought up as far as NES is concerned, the Capcom games immediately come to mind, the greatness of DuckTales and Chippendale, but one that gets kind of thrown under the bus as the worst of the bunch is Tailspin, and for good reason. It's just kind of a boring, bland, scrolling shooter. It's okay looking, has some decent music, but nowhere near the epicness that was the other Disney Capcom soundtracks. It has the cool mechanic of being able to turn upside down and kind of go backwards through levels, but this ends up being clunky and more of a nuisance than actually a fun overall gameplay mechanic. The levels also really don't do anything fun or exciting with the license, and this is why Tailspin ends up making this list. Some are going to immediately see this game and think, hey, that's actually a Snoopy game, that's not a Donald Duck game, and you would be right, but Donald Duck originally was released in Japan for the Famicom, and due to licensing had to be changed when it was brought over to North America. It's just an okay Olympic-style game with a few weird events like the boot toss and the pizza stacking walking game. The controls overall leave a lot to be desired, and there are so many better Olympic-style games, so even though I loved Snoopy back in the day and kinda have a soft spot for this game, overall, Donald Duck or Snoopy doesn't save this game from just being bland. A kind of forgotten cartoon nowadays, Bonkers was a really fun one back in the day. Having the police cat Bonkers in Toontown with all the crazy cartoon characters that get kind of thrown into the mix made for a pretty enjoyable overall animation. However, the games related to them were kind of hit or miss. The one on the SNES, very fun, but the one on the Game Gear and Master System, not so much. It ends up just amounting to a very, very slow-moving platformer with bland backgrounds and just okay gameplay. If you're gonna play one Bonkers-related game, of course, go with the SNES one. Hercules may be one of those mid to late 90s Disney movies that some people may not look at as fondly as some of the other classic ones, but I still very much enjoy it. However, when it came to video games, the PlayStation one wasn't too bad. But then there's the Game Boy one, and boy, this game not only looked and felt bland, the action with a character like Hercules was unacceptable. You had a really short-ranged weapon for your sword, and just everything just didn't feel right. The game never at any point really becomes fun, and is much more of a chore to finish than actually an enjoyable one. With such a great license like Hercules, how did they fail so bad? The Hunchback of Notre may not be talked about as much as one of the classic Disney movies, but it's one of my personal favorites, with some of the best music, I think, of the Disney Renaissance. However, when it came to video games, they only made one title, and that was Hunchback of Notre Topsy-Turvy Games, a collection of minigames for the Game Boy. But these weren't fun minigames. You had a bad Breakout clone, Balloon Fight-esque game which had some awful controls, a puzzle game where you just moved pictures around, and even a bowling game, which honestly doesn't make sense for why any of these games really fall in with the Hunchback of Notre license. Overall, there are a bunch of minigame compilations out there, but Hunchback of Notre Topsy-Turvy Games is one of the worst. Beauty and the Beast is one of the most beloved Disney movies of all time, and for good reason, and they released several video games based off of it. But Beauty and the Beast on the NES, which thankfully was released only in Europe, is the worst. This game not only looks really bad as far as the backgrounds, it doesn't sound very good, and overall, even with getting to play as the Beast, which should be epic to play as, just overall isn't that fun and makes for an okay, mediocre action game at the best. Factor in the really awkward snowball fight scene with one of the worst sprites in the history of the NES in Belle's snowball fight scene sprite, you have overall a really bad Disney title. Mulan may have been one of those late 90s movies that some people really loved and other ones see as kind of the fall of the Disney Renaissance. I still really enjoy it and love singing along to the songs. The Game Boy game, though, is one of the worst that Disney ever had their name on. It has some of the worst controls and some of the worst looking graphics. It's a Game Boy game, it's hard to judge it, but man, just look at some of these backgrounds and sprite animations. Just overall, everything feels bad to play. It's not an overall fun game, it's extremely short and has almost non-existent sound and music. With such great music from the movie, it would have been cool to see some renditions of that in the game, and they really kind of fail at doing so. Mulan is one of the worst looking, playing, and sounding Game Boy games you'll ever have the disprivilege of playing. Before we get to number 1, a couple of honorable mentions. While it was one of the earliest of the Disney games on the NES, Mickey Mousecapade still really isn't overall that fun, with the whole controlling Mickey and Minnie at the same time, having Minnie die and you instantly end up losing a life, and just overall very short and not always the funnest of the platformers. Mickey Mousecapade may not be terrible, but it's certainly not that great. You may be familiar with the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle series, but the licensing and releases for these games is absolutely insane. It actually started as a Roger Rabbit game for the Famicom Disk System, was turned into the Mickey Mouse series on the Game Boy. Later entries in that series got turned into Garfield and Ghostbusters related games on Game Boy as well. This whole series is extremely convoluted as far as its release schedule goes, and overall just never really did anything for me. I never liked not being able to jump or really combat the opponents that you were dealing with in each level. But I know it has its fans, so I didn't want to throw it on the absolute worst list. Before I decided to do this list, I knew what my number 1 was going to be, and that's Aladdin for the NES. A lot of people don't even know that Aladdin was ported over to the NES, and there's some confusion due to bootlegs being released with the Aladdin name. But Aladdin was officially released in Europe for the NES, and it's based off the Sega Genesis version. And this is one of the worst ports and worst versions of a game of all time. They could not get the controls right. Everything just looks awful with like outlines on the characters and just overall really bad gameplay in comparison to the brilliant Genesis game that it was based off of. In fact, the bootleg Aladdin game, which was based on the SNES version, actually plays a ton better than this version. It's really sad that an official Aladdin game was awful and a bootleg one ended up being really fun, both being released late for the NES. So there you have it, the 10 worst 8-bit Disney-related titles. Which ones didn't make the list that you would like to see, or which ones would you like to see on a future list? I'm going to be doing the 16-bit worst Disney titles very soon. Like always, this is my opinion, and there's some games on this list I actually do kind of enjoy still playing, like Tailspin or Jungle Book, at least in small doses. But anyway guys, that's going to wrap up this top 10. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course I hope you enjoyed.